Thanks for listening again to another episode of Architacora. This is going to be a super exciting episode because right here I have my friend Albert Elias, who's a design technologist. He's an entrepreneur and he's a overall information architect. So I think it's going to be a super exciting episode. He's going to tell us about a little bit about who he is, his opinions, and peek about what type of narrative the world of technology can tell us. So here's Albert.
Hi, Zoe. Thank you for having me.
So nice to have you.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
For today's episode, we just have some questions for you about basically just to get an idea about who you are and what you do. And my first question to you was basically, how did you become an information or this data architect?
So, I mean, it really, I think information architect is a term that I kind of came up with because I think it has a different term in computer science, but really what I do now is I mostly work with information and data. So coming from an architectural background, no longer just designing buildings or spaces, I'm actually manipulating and designing information. So for me, information architect is sometimes you're designing things that are not necessarily seen, and you're designing with patterns and algorithms and relationships that can be spatial in nature, but it's really about understanding information and then using that to develop a product, a technology, or a design.
That's awesome. So when you mean as information, it's kind of like a conglomeration of the data that you're referring to create something.
Exactly. So it can be a visualization, it can be a product or a algorithm or a software, but really it's about using the design skills and approaches we use for designing a building and architecture, but instead we're using it for product architecture or user experience or trying to just solve a problem. So it's just using that extra layer of information besides the visual 3D representation of geometry, and then adding those things that are not necessarily visual in nature, so data on top of that to make things more intelligent.
Awesome. And how do you even, I see that you're very data or numbers oriented. So how did architecture came to be your career?
So, I mean, I think in reality, I'll eventually become a physicist. I'm very interested in science and nature. And I think my perspectives of the world resonate really well, or resonate a lot with how my fascination with nature and science and physical phenomenon in this universe. So for me, I was always really interested in sciences. I used to study like chemistry and biology and astronomy as a kid growing up, and I always thought that that's what I would do. And I changed my degree a few times in college. I went from engineering to aerospace engineering to back into architecture. So for me, it was like more of just an understanding of, how I could take that interest and do something with it in a way that would be fulfilling for me. And I always loved building things growing up. I always used to build with either Legos or whether it was like building like contraptions or forts or little inventions that I would make. I was always building and creating. So I always knew kind of in the back of my mind that I would be an architect. Because I just liked working with my hands. I liked making things. I liked creating. I was always very creative. And so I guess what happened is that when I was in engineering school, I felt that I didn't really appreciate or understand the value of creativity in engineering at the time. For me, the classes were very restrictive and very I wasn't able to fulfill so much of an artistic or creative side in the classes. But now looking back on it, I think that I would totally approach it in a different way. But at the time, I felt like, it's too restricted. So I thought, architecture is this really nice medium between art and math and creativity and science. So that was, for me, it felt like, all right, natural for me to jump into that. So I changed my major and I started taking classes, and I really thrived in it. It came super natural to me. And it was just something that was really, it felt really fulfilling. So I felt like I was in the right place. And then long story short, through architecture school, I realized that I really have a strong engineering side of my approach to things. And I think it stems from this fascination with science and physics and the natural world and how it works. So all of my architecture projects were basically rooted in understanding and designing with this perspective of not just the human perspective, but of one of a universal phenomenon. So a lot of it's geared towards designing at the level of a molecule, understanding how different biologies or chemistries and reactions happen in materials, how that might expand upon the experience of architecture, not just at the human level, but even at the ecosystem and environmental level. So this fascination with environmental systems and how all of that works is definitely at the core of a lot of the concepts I come up with in my architectural designs. And then stemming from there, basically, I realized that in order to capture all this information, you need to have a lot of data and a lot of ways to collect that information, and then a lot of ways to then manipulate that information. So when you're looking at things like geospatial information, GIS information, if you're looking at environmental data, these data sets are really, really, really intense as far as like the capacity or the amount of information you can get. And then, understanding how that data translates into some kind of realization or an epiphany of what that can be used for, it's a big hurdle to get through whenever you're approaching things from a very visual perspective. So I realized that in order to manipulate all that information, I had to teach myself how to manipulate the computer to a more sensitive degree. So I started teaching myself computer programming. I started taking classes in computer science while I was still in architecture school, graduate school. And then I basically, from that learned that, computer science and programming is super core to being able to take that information and actually manipulate it to create better designs, to create better problems, or to create better solutions to problems,
right,
and create better technology. So this hybrid of computational design is where I'm at now, which is really taking my architectural design background and experience and now blending that with my computer science and information approach to design. So I like to really just see it as an extension of what we do as designers, but using more of a scientific approach or more of a data-centric approach to how we design.
That's really cool, because I see it as you're trying to find the theory of everything within. That's why the reason why you were looking for engineering, then computer design, then you went to architecture. You just want to know a little bit of everything.
I'm pretty much interested in just about everything.
That's why I'm telling you.
It's very hard
and that comes also from the perspective of a physicist, about knowing the meaning of the world and why do we do the things we do. So
I often say I want to live a million lives in one life.
Well, maybe someday that we'll be able to do that. So I see that you're getting a lot of inspiration from these classes and the way that you work in terms of how you produce their stuff. So this is the way that you get inspired, or do you have any other special method to it?
That's a good question. For me, inspiration it's not always consistent, but it's definitely always rooted in trying to understand the world and trying to understand like people and myself. I think for me, it's always about creating a story or creating a feeling. A lot of times it can just start from a feeling. But inspiration for me is, like trying to understand the world a little bit on a deeper level. And it doesn't have to necessarily be reality. If you can change the way that I view something or perceive something just to make the world a little bit more interesting. I think that's inspiring for me. I'm not sure if an example would help make any sense, but it's kind of hard to answer that question.
I know. That's why. Or maybe we can think it back on from like school. Like, how did you got inspired before you started a project, or when you do a project? How do you do a research process, or do you sketch, or do you make notes, or do you just dive right into it to see what you come up with and start experimenting with what is there already, or you just want to create it from scratch?
Sometimes it's instinctive, meaning like I just have a gut feeling, and that gut feeling is so strong that I just run with it and expand upon it. Sometimes it could be more of a scientific approach, meaning like I'm trying to solve a problem or optimize or capitalize on an opportunity. So it's like, I think a combination of the two. Whereas like if I visit a site or I'm going to solve a problem, I might just see like a couple of things that really I find interesting. And I think what I ultimately do is I'm very good at abstracting things down to their, like abstracting information in a way that it becomes more and more less direct. This is really hard for me to put into words. I
know. It's a complicated question. I just wanted to see a little bit about what you see.
I really like to abstract ideas down to their core. And maybe that's something that a physicist would kind of do. So even though I'm not trained as a physicist and I would like to eventually get there, I think the way that I think, it's all about abstracting information to get to this core fundamental understanding of what it is. So I do that with everything, whether it's beauty or art or color or sound or information that I'm looking at on a site. I try to abstract it down to its core fundamental property that I find intriguing. And then I try to reinterpret that or expand upon it in a new way. So one thing I could say is like when I look at, let's say, I'm looking at a plant or I'm looking at like a structural condition on a site, I'm always trying to figure out what is the behavior or the logic that's happening in front of me, and then how can I gain inspiration or reinterpret that in a different way.
Awesome. So and from my own point of view, when I start a project, I just start sketching and just start creating. But my style of the storytelling style, I just want to understand what people are gonna do in that space. I'm more about the people experience, and you're about the whole experience.
I think it's like the first step for my design process is exploration and adventure. So like I really just want to dive in and see as much and understand as much about it, and just explore in whatever dimension that design is working in. So if it's like a project for, whether it's space architecture or building your house alongside of a coastline, I want to first explore that area, and that whether it's an area of science or a physical site or a concept, I want to just dive in and explore first. And then from there, I start to, try to look at all the information and then abstract it into like, what is the core fundamental property that connects all of these things together? That's kind of how if I put it into words, I would say that's kind of what I do.
Exactly. No, I think that's an amazing, and even the way that you're even expressing yourself and the way that you talk about it, it kind of seems like a convoluted, not a convoluted, just like a process of ideas that just lead you to a place that eventually might create something or just experiment something and then just become something anew or just continue exploring.
It's almost like I'm not really interested at looking at things as the way they are. I'm more interested in figuring out what is the core fundamental property that makes this the reality that I'm seeing. So like I'm not always taking things exactly how I see them. I try to understand that my perspective is linked to my previous experiences, and plus the way that my brain functions and sees the world. And that there's a big gap between what we see every day as reality and what actually is reality. And a lot of that is based on perception and personality. And I guess for me, I always try to figure out like this abstraction of what I'm seeing to figure out the core property or the core value of or behavior. And then, just to make things a little bit more interesting, how can you reuse that or manipulate it or change it in a different way.
Right. So will you say that's why do you believe in this type of gathering data and information, that you study and actually teach what your field was your
mathematics
field?
is fascinating because it can be so artistic and beautiful, but it's so rigid and it's a logic, it's relationships, it's patterns, it's really just how the world works, you know. So for me, it's super interesting to see things from a mathematical perspective compared to like the human perspective. I don't know, there's something really nice about the two when you combine them together.
Awesome.
So like for me, like a lot of times computational design, I feel like it's too rigid and too focused on algorithms and data and optimization. And I like the mixing of two, where sure, you can have the most optimized structure, but maybe just for fun, we're gonna have like some like interesting, like cute, like more artistic combination involved into it. So I think there needs to be a level of both. Otherwise, you know, I guess it's like the most beautiful thing about a pattern is how it diverges or how it breaks apart. Of this platonic form, right? This perfect form. Things wouldn't be as interesting as like, you know, like I'm looking at these leaves right now and, you know, there's like this one leaf that's almost perfect, you know, but if all of the leaves are perfect, then you wouldn't have a really interesting world. So it's like, it's these differences and these scars or these, probably a better word. So I like to understand the core behavior and property, and then I start to like basically create hierarchy or anomalies on top of that core property and reuse it in different ways. I guess it's kind of like mutation.
Yeah.
Mutation might be an interesting word.
And evolution.
Evolution, yeah.
Yeah, and the intersection of new organic beings like coming together and creating.
Yeah, I mean that my thesis was based on the what happens when you design at a level of the molecule. Okay. So nanotechnology, biomedical engineering, molecular engineering. These are things that I'm super, super interested in. When you are designing at that scale, you're understanding, you know, you're not just making something out of a material, you're making the material, and then that material can make something on its own. So it's like you're developing an intelligent material from the start, almost like a nano computer, you know, that has its own level of intelligence and its own ability to design and create. So I don't know, these things are all intertwined and intersected for me in the way that I think and the way that I design, but I'm not quite clear how they all line up just yet.
No, and that's the question that we have, like, because that's the question of life. How do we progress to this? So speaking from there, like, how do you see the designs technologies right now that are in architecture, and how do you think are progressing? Do you think, are we moving at a good pace, or do you think we should do some things differently? So like, what are your opinions on the matter?
In technology in general?
Yeah.
I think that as amazing as the things that we're progressing are, and we should continue to keep progressing, I think the world needs to slow down a bit. I think this whole coronavirus pandemic that we're experiencing right now is a really good example of that. You know, I think the world of overconsumption and just pushing the next technology faster and faster without really taking a moment to step back and, you know, see how things have connected, and to see how, like, to question, you know, what is the direction we really want to go. I think that's super important, and I think that's something that we need to do more of. So I think, especially in a time like now, just taking moments of reflection as humanity, as a species, and really defining and deciding on where we want to go. And I think that's going to help. In doing so, I think that'll help us solve issues like global warming and climate change. And so I think that's something that, yes, technology is definitely an amazing thing, and that's basically what I do every day. I really think that as a species, as humanity, we need to just take a moment of reflection and look at our history and look at the trajectory of where we're going, and make decisions for new technology based off of what we think is going to be best for the world we want to see. rather than then this like kind of reaction to, you know, an economy or a society, or, you know, this idea of like, I almost feel like we're at a point where technology and the understanding that technology moves fast creates more and more speed of technology
to exponential.
And it's like, it's almost to the point that, you know, we're not even in control anymore. It's just like the technology, the computers are making their own computers, robots are building robots. And it's like, it's almost like we're giving up. We're just like kind of like, let's saying like, okay, this is the future, this is what's going to happen. We're not deciding our future. We're rather just watching it happen and unfold in front of us. So I think this idea of like taking a moment to step back and reflect is really important.
Right. I agree with that. I think it's a movement that sometimes we're creating for the sake of creation and not really thinking about how we impact our surroundings. Just because
it's a social thing too, like wanting to be first in everything and wanting to compete with each other, and to this whole social media like aspects, not just like Instagram or Facebook. It's also, you know, research papers, like how people are trying to get published first and being the first to do this and the first to do this. And
yeah, so they can copyright it and then
yeah, I think it's
comes out money.
It causes an unnecessary amount of stress on everyday life. And I think it's like this rush of competition to compete with each other that we're missing out on what we have already. Exactly. And I think this idea of slowing down and being more reflective is going to make us better designers, better scientists, better writers. And I think that's something that we really need to do.
I agree. Since you're a technologist, I think it will be a kind of weird question to ask you this, but if you didn't do that today, what would you do instead? You were saying physicist or like an engineer, but why?
I don't know. I just always had this fascination with nature. And I grew up on the water in South Florida. Like I was always on the beach or in the Everglades or on a lake somewhere. Like I was always raised by the water. So for me, there's something really essential there to my understanding of the world. It's like I'm always looking at like underwater worlds or oceans or lakes, and I used to have fish tanks growing up, and like I was always fascinated with the way that the natural world works and the way that water chemistry works and the way that plants grow, and the way that there's these connected ecosystems between like nitrogen and carbon dioxide, and the way that plants use both of them to create ecosystems. I don't know, I was just always fascinated with these processes, and I was always studying them, and I'm not an expert on any of it, but I'm beyond fascinated with it. So I always try to like study it in different moments of time, and I use whatever information I gather in those projects or those investigations to the best of my ability for design.
Yeah, I can see you doing something else, something crazy, being a biologist and surfing the waves.
Yeah. I think if I could choose the best way to spend my time as whatever occupation I would do, is probably be just studying nature somewhere, whether it's on a boat, studying the ocean, or in the Amazon, studying the forest. I'm really interested in that.
So in Architacora, we give like a very strong importance to the narrative, to basically just tell your own story. And I wanted to see how do you personally apply narrative in the work that you do, for example, at school, at FIU, or even in your personal projects with your own company?
So for me, it goes back to this idea of abstraction. If you can take a problem or an opportunity and you can abstract it, you can find its core behavior, and then you can reinterpret that narrative using that core behavior. So you can be accurate and you can optimize something, or you can basically make a proposal, let's say for a building, that is maybe it's not obvious to your client or to someone looking at it that that's the best option. But if you understood and abstracted the core behavior of the information in front of you,
Right.
You can then use that information and that behavior to rebuild your own narrative and basically prove and show that it's the best option. But on top of that, you develop your own story that you're passionate about it. So it's like design can be very subjective. One person can say like, oh, I think this is beautiful. Another person can say, I hate it. But if you can prove that it's the best option or the best solution to a design, no matter what it looks like, because you're using this core behavior of this information, it doesn't matter what it looks like as long as you're using that core. So it's like, it's kind of a combination of problem solving as well as like your own personal passion and your like architectural baggage all combined to create this narrative or this story. So it's almost like you want to craft a narrative in a way that makes sense, but is also, you have to resonate it with it too in order to sell it, in order to inspire people with it. If it's not passionate to you and it's just fully optimized, then that's not going to be able to tell a good story or convince someone to invest in a project. But if it's also completely just your passion and there's none of this core logic that's driving it, then one person might like it, another person might hate it. It's going to just be totally subjective. So I basically drive stories through this combination of really this core fundamental understanding of the logic and the behaviors of how a system might work, and integrate that into a narrative that I'm passionate about, and the combination of the two. So I think that would be the way I could kind of
explain
it. Yeah.
So it's basically creating that compromise or like between your visuals and the clients or the person that you're showing it to, so there be an understanding from both parties.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to design, in order to be productive, I believe you have to be passionate about it. So it's definitely going to be a part of the designer's heart and soul in the project. But also for technology, user experience is really the core of technology. You know, you have to be able to really understand the opportunity that you're trying to give your client, or the problem that they are really facing and you're trying to solve for them. So really understanding that user experience, and more personalized information for me is key. How can I give you exactly what you need in the shortest, concise amount of way possible, and give you a solution for that? So user experience is really important for that.
Right. So do you think that there's a similarity between visual narrative in different fields, since you're talking about this?
Absolutely. I mean, it's in everything. It's in the way that you talk, it's in the way that you write, it's in the way that you do anything, whether it's architecture, film, video games, drawing, painting. I mean, there's something interesting, like, for example, I might look at something and just from my own visual, like my eye, I might think, wow, that's really ugly. Like, let's say it's a table or furniture, like a piece, and or artwork. I might look at it and be like, wow, that's really ugly. Or maybe I look at it and I'm like, wow, this is beautiful. But I realized the things that like maybe I don't like right away is I can give a story to this piece, meaning like it has like a feeling or an emotion. Like maybe the colors are really washed out and that reminds me of like a certain place and time.
Exactly.
And if I can give myself like that story behind an object, then I'm gonna be more likely to think that it's beautiful, even if my first reaction is that it's ugly. And so I find that the narrative is super important, more so than just proportion and like this like idea of physical beauty. You know, it's like something can be grotesque or really bizarre and unproportionate, but if you can give this story or narrative to that, it can become really beautiful in the way that people perceive it. So this idea of perception, I think, is really key, I think it's why stories are so important, because perception is that you talk about like abstracting things to its core in mathematics, like perception is that gap between, the world that we see every day, perception is the gap between the reality and the world that we see every day. And that can be translated and manipulated and changed based off of this narrative. So narrative really for us drives everything about everything that we do. It's perception.
Exactly. In my own term for narratives is basically you're telling the public or you're telling a second person, because even though the narrative we create is always for another person, because you can create it for yourself, but you're always hoping that you're like someone else will understand where you're coming from and they generate their own perspective based on the information that you give them. So that's why I think it's interesting when I'm sorry?
It's a way of communicating.
Exactly. I think even years ago, like and that way of communications has been going around even before the written word. Before we used to have painting walls, so it's something that has always been there. My second to last question to you, Albert, because we have been going on for a bit. The term generalist has gained popularity in the last few years, especially in the last 5 years. And by generalist, I mean the person that needs to know a little bit about everything. So basically an architect. And I wanted your opinion about it. Do you think it's something that is true, that is not, that architects need to know a lot about everything, or our careers have to know about everything, or it's just something that is specific to one style of field?
I think it depends on your personality. There's some people that are more of a implementer, or more of a like they want to just solve the problem and they want to just focus on that problem, or they want to find a solution to something or a specific field or area of interest. So I would imagine something like a scientist that's really focused on a certain area of science, or an engineer that's really focused on a certain area of engineering. I think for them, like being specialized is super helpful, because you can get to a level of detail that if someone that's not specialized in, they're not going to be able to find the time to get all the way down to that core fundamental property. But at the same time, I think that this needs to be balanced with people who are more ideators. So people who are more creative types are ideators. So meaning that someone might look at this problem, and even though they don't understand the core details or fundamental properties of it, they can create or look at it in a different way or perspective, and they can then help see it in a new way that might be actually a better direction than looking at like all the information at a very detailed level. So I mean, it's like Albert Einstein, right? A lot of the things he developed in his lifetime, he was saying like the theory of relativity came from his imagination more so than a really concrete, detailed mathematical focus. And it's this idea of like just this question of like this intuition of what happens when you travel at the speed of light. Exactly. And that's something that comes from I think inspiration in arts and other areas of focus rather than a specific, very detailed field. So I think the world needs both. And for architects, designers, and like people who build their own companies, entrepreneurs, you need to know a little bit about everything, more so than you need to be specialized. So I think that the world really, at the moment, is starting to realize more and more that this knowing a little bit about everything is really important. And they coined this phrase, design thinking, which is like exactly what we do in architecture.
Exactly.
But I think that's why you see a lot of architects, they become CEOs of top companies, and even if it's not anything to do with building or construction, because we're taught and we have the skill sets to look at a whole wide range of possibilities and problems and opportunities, and we can then connect the dots and propose a solution in a very beautiful, eloquent way. And it's part of that is narrative and story building, and also selling, if you're a CEO. So I think the world needs both.
Right. And do you think that since we have this access nowadays to like online classes and basically the information has been more readily available to a large amount of people, do you think eventually the term specialist will disappear? Because now that we will have access to all kinds of information.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that definitely you benefit from having a wide range of perspectives. But I think there's also those personality types where, like, it's definitely not me. It's the complete opposite of me. But there's definitely personality types where they find the one thing that they truly love and are interested in, and they thrive in it. And they can just go to such a deep level with it and a very intimate level with it. And I think that that's something that really comes down to personality. And I mean, we have information and internet right now, and you still find these people that they just do this one thing and they do it so well, and they're artists at it. And I think that that's something that's more of a personality rather than like a result of what we have today as far as technology and information. On the other hand, I think technology and information is actually overwhelmingly not conducive for living life and living a really optimized or efficient life. I think we have so much information and so much data that it's very hard to find what you're really looking for. And part of that is really just trying to filter the internet and filter all this information.
Right.
So one of the projects I'm working on is called Load Brain. It's really this, how do you use artificial intelligence to understand enough about you as a person to be able to then filter the internet for all the information that's relative to what you're looking for. So this personalized information is super important. And I think that's something that right now the internet is super inflated. There's so much new and more information that's not relevant and redundant and reused. And it's just at the access to your fingertips constantly. So how can we leverage technology to, really optimize this in a way that it's not just used for ads, but actually to get you the information that you need? And I truly believe that it's not just a matter of using AI to optimize the internet. You first have to know, yourself. You first have to do some reflection. You have to know like what is important to you, and you have to do your homework and understand what do you really want out of life first. So this kind of like life coaching approach, I think, is really important before you even start searching. The second thing is like, how do you then support that? Like, so let's say you figure out what you want to do. How do you have the financial model to do so? We're not really taught any of this. We're not taught how to be introspective and to learn about ourselves. We're told what we're supposed to do. So figuring out what you really want to do is really crucial and hard, and the first step. And then the second step is being able to fund those efforts. I don't think that we're really taught how to create a good financial model, or how to be successful once you have that idea. And the third step is then how do you then, so let's say you have the financial model, you know exactly what you want to do. Where do you go to find the information? And that's where Load Brain is really trying to do, is trying to optimize all three of those for people so that they can really live their life in a way that's not working. Like, I don't think people need to be working 40 hours a week. I think we should just work like 3 days out of the week, and the rest should just
very European.
Yeah, the rest should just be enjoying and focusing on the beauties of life and reflection, and spending time with loved ones. I think if you had a platform that could optimize and really personalize information, I think most of our time is spent looking and searching for things, and we don't even know why we're searching for them, and we're just like kind of running around without really like having this really like focused and optimized way of getting information. And I think it goes back to technology. We need more of that reflection, and we need more of that that understanding of where we're going.
Yeah, I agree with all this, but I think we have time for one more question for you, Albert. And after all this talk, I just wanted to ask you if you feel, what do you have learned with architecture in the end for you personally? Do you think you will study it again? You will go through the 5 years of architecture again? Do you think you will do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would. I think architecture for me is a living laboratory. It's an area of study that you can take any form of idea, whether it's science, mathematics, art, philosophy, and you can actually create something that's useful for people from those ideas. So it's like a scientist might do research in the lab and publish a paper, but there's a lot of really strict regulations with science and how it's being conducted in order for it to be science. For architecture, you could just take a small sliver of that idea or that concept, that technology, that biological process, and you can just expand on it and create a whole new world from it. And it's perfectly valid in that sense. As long as it's creating something that's useful for people or the environment, it becomes this living laboratory. So it's like, it can be scientific in nature, it can be artistic in nature, but it's like you have this flexibility to merge the two worlds and just create something entirely new. And the best part about it is that it's being seen and used by people, and it can influence and benefit people's lives. So it's really, for me, the perfect medium to conduct all this research and to expand and transcend all these ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree, because, for me, architecture, I've been having my love and hate relationship for the past few years, thinking that maybe I should go into cinematography or just stick with VFX, because that's kind of what I'm into. I love to create these stories that are animated and people are able to see it. But I realized that architecture gave me the way to understand spaces and sense of scale, and gave me the advantage that normally, if this specialist careers, sometimes they help you focus and be very good at a point. But I feel that architecture, as you were saying, it gives you the chance to change. Like you can move around and becomes this lab, as you were saying, of creatives.
I don't see the difference between architecture and technology. For me, it's just another form of technology. It's because you're developing something for people to use and for people to benefit from. And I mean, like when you look at something like film and cinematography, it's just being viewed. But architecture is being viewed, it's being felt, it's being heard, it's all of the senses, it's like, and a lot of times that could be like technology as well. So for me, architecture and technology we're getting back to like this understanding the core fundamental and the core behavior of everything. For me, architecture is just technology, but I think it's the culture of what the architectural world brings. It's this, the culture of an architect is what makes it different from typical technology. And I think that comes down to this idea of this history of art and engineering combined into what architecture is, and the way that we tell stories through it.
And I completely agree with that. I see what you're seeing, and I think that's why architecture is so exciting. Even though it's crazy to do so, because only us crazy people and very a minimal amount of people go through that through the 5 years and actually get a degree. It's always at least good to have some type of architectural knowledge in general, just take one class or just to get yourself into this new realm of design.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very hard to explain these concepts. I think we'd have to do this podcast at least 4 more times in order for us to pick the right words to explain these ideas. And maybe part of that is also, me not reading enough into the terminologies or histories of these things and how they're typically expressed. But definitely these ideas are hard to translate.
Yeah, that's why the conversation, that's why the core of this show is just about talking on the narratives of everyone, so they can see that even though we're kind of different, in the end, we have some similarities that helps us become a bigger community that we thought we were. Mm-hmm. And I think that's everything. I think that's all the questions that I have for you for this episode. And I just wanted to really, really thank you for being the first person and being here and just telling you about who you are and what drives you, because I think it's fascinating from your point of view and how you see this world in a mathematical and like wholeness way, while I see it as a way to like how the person walks and framing a picture, and you see it in the whole thing. So it's always interesting to see the contrast as both being architects.
thank you for having me and letting me have the time to explain. Definitely, I think if you caught me on another day, it might be a completely different conversation,
right?
I think things change every single day, but yeah, today is my explanation for Sunday.
Well, that's a good day to explain. Well, I think that's it for this episode of Architacora. Thank you, everyone. Please don't forget to go to iTunes and leave a little review and write that little comment and those 5 stars that help us appearing more and more and grow this community. So again, thank you everyone for listening. I'm your host, soy Rusia Moreno, saying goodbye once again. We'll hear each other in the next episode of Architacora. Keep on creating. Thank you for listening. Bye.